All right, very welcome to everybody on this Sunday, August 17th, to this version of Noisy Reality. My name is Jim Dingman, and I'm joined with Professor John Ferling. Professor John Ferling is an emeritus professor at the University of West Georgia. He is also someone who has contributed mightily to our knowledge of the Revolution and the period of the Revolution, the American Revolution, that is, since he did his work back in the 70s on Joseph Galloway, the Loyalist Mind, which I must admit I remember reading years ago. And as I was teasing him a little bit before, and I said, "Oh, there's another book on the Loyalists. Wow, let's go." Um, and then, of course, and I guess it was sort of a '60s phenomenon in a way, but there was a lot of work on loyalism being done at the time. Then he did a book, A Wilderness of Miseries. I did a one-volume biography of George Washington, First of Men. And then he did books that were dealing with the military history, political military history, Struggle for a Continent, The Wars of Early America in 93, Setting the World Ablaze, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and the American Revolution in 2000, A Leap in the Dark, The Struggle to Create the American Republic in 2003. Then I understand one of your bestsellers, Adams versus Jefferson, The Tumultuous Election of 1800, and why do you think that was such a bestseller, John?
Well, I think people get interested in it every 4 years when there's another election. And especially if there's a possibility that the election may wind up in the House of Representatives.
Ah,
So,
ah, okay. And then there's all these back and forths between them that also is reminiscent of our contemporary period. Then he did a very good book about the crucial period of the American Revolution, also Miracle, the American Victory in the War of Independence, another book on Washington, The Ascent of George Washington, the Hidden Political Genius of an American Icon, then a biography of John Adams, Independence, the Struggle to Set America Free in 2011, Jefferson and Hamilton, the rivalry that forged a nation, and then again, a whole series of books that dealt with the revolution in different contexts. Whirlwind, the American Revolution, the War That Won It, Apostles of Revolution, Jefferson, Payne, Monroe, and the Struggle Against the Old Order in America and Europe, Winning Independence and Decisive Years of the Revolutionary War. And then the book we come to talk to about today, which is Shots Heard Around the World, America, Britain, and Europe in the Revolutionary War. Well, very welcome to have you here, Professor.
well, thank you for having me.
And it's really great to have you here. Now, first of all, I wanted you to share with us your take on the causality issues of the American Revolution, because as you know, when the 1619 Project came out, and I know Gerald Horne and all these others, everybody started arguing about the Somerset Act and the different decisions in England that had to do with emancipation, and the argument came into the picture that the causality was that the colonists wanted to prevent emancipation, and we know that the issue of slavery was one that was ripe in the situation, usually not emphasized in the older histories of the American Revolution. And then, of course, in more recent years, and you see this in how Burns is crafting this documentary on the American Revolution, he has scholars like Ned Blackhawk at Yale, Michael Whitkin at Columbia, Colin Calloway at Dartmouth, talking about the Native American part of that picture, which again was something not emphasized maybe 20 or 30 years ago. But what's your take on all that? And also, if you could go into what happens after the end of the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War in 1763, and all the different acts, and all because it's totally legitimate on the part of England to try to pay for the cost of the war. I mean, it's not unreasonable. So, what do you think of all that bouillabaisse of opinions that we have here?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I always tell my audiences that there were probably as many different reasons why people supported the revolution as there were people. There were just so many different things. That one of the explanations that I like best was right after Lexington and Concord, the revolutionary government in Massachusetts took depositions from people who were engaged in the fighting on April 19th as the British retreated from Concord back to Boston. And one of the comments among, I don't know, probably dozens of comments was by just an ordinary farmer named Levi Preston, who fought that day. And you stop and think about it, that this guy was probably out plowing his fields the day before, and the next day he's putting his life on the line fighting the British. And so they asked him, well, why did you go to war with the British? And he said, we always thought we should govern ourselves, and they didn't think we should. And I think that was a summation of what a great many people thought, that they wanted self-government, they wanted to control their own destiny. They didn't want an imperial government that was 3,000 miles away making the decisions for them. But beyond that, I think there's economic factors involved. Merchants were trying to expand their trade, and there were restrictions on their trading capabilities given British navigation laws and whatever. There were very ambitious colonists who, like John Adams, for example, who I'm sure if we could bring him back and talk with him today, he would probably admit, look, I wanted a chance to sit in a really important legislative assembly, or perhaps hold a cabinet position. I could never do that in the British Empire. Or somebody like Washington, who was clearly very ambitious, and serving in the military in the French and Indian War was, I think, the biggest thing in his life to that point, because when he set for his first portrait about 2 years before the Revolutionary War broke out, even though he was a successful planter and businessman, he put on his old
Right.
Virginia Regiment
Colonel
uniform.
uniform, yeah.
Yeah, that's how he wanted to be remembered. But he could never be a high officer in the British Army. Even as a colonel in the Virginia Regiment, he was lower than a lieutenant in the British Army. So ambition plays a role. After that 1619 book came out, and it argued that fighting to preserve slavery was the crucial thing. I think there is some truth to that, in the sense that after Lord Dunmore raised his regiment, yeah, the
Right.
Ethiopian
Regiment,
regiment,
right.
yeah, that there are letters from some of the Southern delegates in Congress that clearly, I mean, this inspired them to keep fighting and no longer seek reconciliation with the British. So I think it was a factor for some, but outside of the South, where slavery was widespread, I don't think it was a particular factor at all. And in fact, what you run into in the course of the Revolution is that ultimately people like John Adams and other politicians in the 1780s and as you approach the founding of the government under the Constitution, they realized that the slavery issue was such a volatile issue that the Union was going to be divided if they pushed to end slavery. So they made compromises. They chose the Union over trying to get rid of slavery. They did what they could to bring an end to slavery by making slavery illegal in the Northwest Territory and trying to hem it in and prevent its expansion. And they were over optimistically thought that slavery might just cease to exist within another generation or so. And I think they underestimated some things, and one was I didn't realize the impact of the cotton gin, which was only just being invented about that time and revolutionized agriculture in the South. But I think, other than Levi Preston's comment about they wanted to govern themselves, I think that's the main thing. They hope to establish a government that could stand on its own and would be free of Europe. And John Adams talked about we've been the ball that's been kicked around by the European countries for a long time. The colonists were dragged into one war after another that began in Europe. And the wars were important to Europe, but not particularly important to the American colonists. But yet they got dragged into them, and they wanted to escape that and control their own fate and possibly escape wars. And they were able to escape European wars for the most part. There was a war of 1812, but for the most part, they were able to escape European warfare until World War One comes along about 125 years later.
Now, when you look at the arguments about the acts that precipitated directly, a lot of focus, you go through the Stamp Act, the reaction to that, which you've mentioned. Then you get to the question of the East India Company deciding to deal with its market problems and then dumping tea into the United States, to the colonies, and then the Boston Tea Party. So is that the real precipitous event that sort of sways the aristocracy and the rulers in England that we have to now deal with these guys in a very tough way?
Yeah, I think absolutely it was until the Boston Tea Party, the British had really followed a policy of appeasement. They had abandoned the Stamp Act. They modified the Townshend duty so that it only left a portion of the taxation. And I think what Lord North was trying to, he becomes the prime minister in Great Britain in 1770, and he remains the prime minister throughout the war. And I think what he's trying to do is just, if at all possible, just buy time and let the next generation deal with the issue. But then once they learn of the Boston Tea Party, I think there's just real bitterness in England that we've appeased these guys and they've now stabbed us in the back by destroying property. It's one thing to go out and march in the streets and another thing to destroy property. And once property was destroyed, and we talk about it as a party, the Boston Tea Party, but it did involve the destruction of a considerable amount of property and money that belonged to the East India Company. And so I think that's the point that they really start talking about using force to resolve the issue. But interestingly, initially, their initial reaction to the Boston Tea Party was not to use force, but to try to avoid using force by isolating Massachusetts and imposing the coercive acts on it and changing the Constitution in Massachusetts and closing the port of Boston and kind of an economic reprisal against them. Something like we talk a lot today about imposing sanctions on other countries. And in essence, that was the step that the British were taking initially after the Boston Tea Party. And I think the feeling was, we'll see how the colonists respond to this. We think that they'll cave in. Massachusetts maybe won't, but the other 12 colonies are not going to go along with Massachusetts, they thought, and that this can resolve the issue without force being used. But when the First Continental Congress meets in response to the coercive acts, it obviously defies England. It in fact votes to further restrict trade with all of Great Britain. And at that point, when the word comes back of what the First Continental Congress had done. And the British learned that about December of 1774. That's the final straw. That's when they make the decision to use force. I think after the Boston Tea Party, Lord North's cabinet had met and discussed using force and discussed, okay, if we go to war, what's the war going to be like? And they came to the conclusion that it would probably be a very short war. The colonists lacked the means of waging a long war. They didn't have a history of cooperating with one another. They didn't have the means of sustaining an army over a long period of time. They were convinced that militia troops couldn't stand up against professional against regular troops like were in the British Army. And so they thought it would be a very short war, maybe even only one battle would solve it. So I think they had discussed all of that when they first learned of the Boston Tea Party, and then when they learn of the Continental Congress's defiance, then they go back and they discuss using force again and just rehearse the same arguments that they had gone through a year before. And that's when they make the decision. Using force is the only solution to this problem. And so in January of 1775, the cabinet votes to use force. And even then, I think that as I said, they learned what had happened with the First Continental Congress in December. And the monarch, George III, tells Lord North, well, don't do anything immediately. Let's take a break over the Christmas holidays and we'll come back again in January and then you make the decision. So he wanted cooler heads to prevail. I don't think he was ducking the issue, of course. I think George III realized that that was the only solutions. He famously said blows must decide the issue, but he wanted everybody to think it through and not act on the spur of the moment. So when North's cabinet comes back in January, they go through all the arguments again, and then they vote to use force. And late in January, Lord Dartmouth, who was the American secretary at the time, and he was one of the few in the North's cabinet who actually opposed using force, but he was the American secretary, so it fell to him to actually write out the order that was sent to General Thomas Gage telling him to use force. And Gage gets that missive from Dartmouth in April of 1775, and he acts on it immediately and sends out the 900-man expedition to Concord to destroy a colonial arsenal there. And that's when the bloodshed first occurred and war was underway then.
Now, one thing that is interesting in this whole picture, I read a very interesting book by the former LA bureau chief in London, Don Cook, and he had a book, The Long Fuse, which basically got into the personalities of the English in this whole period. Lord North, for example, he described as somebody who would snore in the parliamentary meetings. It was very, because you don't get that kind of color. And then the importance of George III coming in at 22 years old to be king of England. What is his role? How do you see? And then there's all these different ministries that occur throughout that period of time. And they're all having different stances towards this burgeoning problem with the colonies. So how do you see all of their behavior in that period?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that after the First Continental Congress defied the British by meeting and resisting the coercive acts, George III was prepared for war, and he was convinced that was the only way that things could be resolved. I don't think the colonists understand that there's the major faction in the Second Continental Congress, which meets about 2 weeks after Lexington and Concord in early May of 1775. They still thought that George III could rescue them. And so they send a petition to George III, asking him to use his office to restrain sort of the war hawks in North's cabinet. But I think they completely misunderstood George the Third. Lord North to me is the most interesting of the figures because he's the prime minister, and it's ultimately his cabinet that's going to make the decision. And I think North really hoped to avoid war if at all possible. He was one that was worried about winning the war. He thought it would be a more difficult task than many other people thought. And they all thought if the war goes on too long, there was a real danger that France and Spain would come into the conflict. The question was how fast could they crush the colonies? And North, I think, was one who worried that it might take a little bit longer than the others thought. And then once the news comes in of Lexington and Concord and then of Bunker Hill, one takes place in April of 75, Bunker Hill in June of 75, and the British learn by about August or so of 1775 what a debacle Bunker Hill had been. And I think at that point, Lord North, he doesn't say this publicly, but I think Lord North really begins at that point to have reservations about whether the British do have the capability of crushing the rebellion. And but he he's serving the king. He knows the king supports the war. He's a loyal supporter of the monarch. He wants to remain as prime minister. And so it's what he then begins to do is raise a much larger army. The British Army had only about 48,000 men at the time the war breaks out in April. And Lord North more than doubled the size of the British Army over, not sure exactly how long a period, but it was a little bit more than a year. Basically, he uses the second half of 1775 and first half of 1776 to expand that army so it grows to a bit over 100,000. And that's of course only the first step, because as men are lost in the course of the war, more replacements will have to be added. But North is committed to the war at that point, and really remains in that position until Saratoga occurs and the capture of Burgoyne's army that was invading New York, the capture of that army at Saratoga in October of 1777. And after that, I think North realized that the best hope is to try to offer legitimate terms of peace to the Americans. He had offered a peace plan in 1775 before he learned of the first battle at Lexington and Concord. But he knew it was a sham offering, and he actually tells George III, "Look, I'm offering him what's called a peace plan, but it's that in name only. It's really designed more to rev up support for the war on the home front here in Britain." But after Saratoga, he comes through with a legitimate peace plan that offers America essentially everything that the First Continental Congress had asked for on the eve of the war. And the problem for Lord North was at the same time, France offered the Americans a treaty of alliance. So they had a choice at this point of accepting North's peace plan and remaining in the British Empire, or accepting the French alliance. And I don't think there was any question what they were going to take. They really thought with France coming into the war, that this guaranteed independence. Washington, in fact, after he learned of the French Franco-American alliance, Washington wrote a number of letters in which he, in essence, says this guarantees our independence. And I think Washington, like Comte de Vergennes, the French foreign minister, who really was responsible for that alliance, both of them thought that peace would come within the next year or so. So there was no question which of the two the Americans would take. And besides, war always embitters people. Getting shot at by somebody is not something that's going to engender friendship toward those people. So the war had gone on since 1775. There had been atrocities. People were paying greater taxes. People were dragged away from home to serve in the military. Men had died and been wounded, and so and towns had been destroyed. And so at that point, there was so much bitterness toward Great Britain that I think choosing the French alliance was an easy choice for them. I think people tend to forget that in all of our lifetimes, our relationship with Great Britain has been a splendid relationship. But from 1775 until really about 1900, there was a great deal of animosity in this country toward Great Britain. And the British really began through things like the Rhodes Scholarship and whatever in the late 19th century to begin to try to foster a better relationship with the Americans. And I think they could see the clouds of World War One coming, and of course the Americans come into World War One on the Allied side.
Well, stepping back to the subject of the book, which is, of course, the international dimensions of the war itself. France, of course, is very important in that picture. And you mentioned Comte de Vergennes, and then, of course, I was laughing because I remember the discussion of Beaumarchais setting up the covert company to basically supply weapons to to the colonies before the intervention. And then you have Spain in the picture. And what's different for England, of course, and for France is unlike the 7 Years' War, where France has to confront Austria, Russia. Excuse me, they're in alliance with Austria and Russia against Prussia. They don't have that problem in this war, in the Revolutionary War. They actually have this, they're able to build, the United States, or the colonies are able to build this alliance structure based on the self-interest of all these international powers against the English, which is very different than the 7 Years' War. And I'm just wondering if you could get into your understanding of the desire and the impetus of France to get into this war, the revenge aspect of the 7 Years' War. What is, and of course, we know that this essentially is one of the precipitating causes of the French Revolution, the expenses that they incur. So I'm just wondering what your take on all that is.
Yeah, sure. Well, the French have, as you said, had lost the 7 Years' War. It ended in 1763. And they lost a good bit of territory. They lost some islands in the Caribbean. They lost Canada. They lost trading areas in Africa and in Asia. And I think, and they lose. I always tell my audiences this is much more important than it sounds like it would be. They lost their access to the Newfoundland fisheries,
Right.
and that doesn't sound that important,
for their seamen,
but
for their seamen.
yeah, there's a lot of money involved in the fishing industry in the 18th century, and it was also a place. The sailors were trained. They learned how to be sailors by being in the fishing industry, so that when France would go to war, they could just move those merchant marine into their French Navy and have skilled sailors. So they wanted access back to the fisheries. And in addition to that, I was sort of surprised. I didn't realize this until I worked on the book, that Vergennes and so many of the others who were in the diplomatic corps in France felt that in the years after 1763, there were a lot of just little things that happened between France and Britain, and the French felt that the British had repeatedly humiliated them. And so they wanted revenge for losing the war, revenge for the way they had been treated as a second class power. They wanted to be restored to the first rank of power that they had enjoyed under Louis XIV and Louis XV. And so revenge is a major factor for the French. And also, I think what's extremely important is that the French felt that Britain derived much of its wealth from their North American colonies, and wealth equaled power. And so, if they could uh, uh, if the American colonies would be separated from Great Britain, and Britain lost those 13 colonies, they would lose that source of wealth, and France would be on a more equal footing with them. But Vergennes and Vergennes' predecessor, Clausel, both realized that the French Navy, which had been decimated during the 7 Years' War, had to be rebuilt, and you couldn't build the Navy overnight. I mean, we built, I don't know, tons of ships in World War II very fast, but that couldn't be done in the 18th century. It took a long time, and almost from the very beginning, they figured that they would not be ready for war until 1778,
Mm.
because that's when the Navy, that they would have a sufficient number of vessels, war vessels, that they would be on an equal footing with Britain. And if they could bring Spain, which was also rebuilding its navy, into a war with Great Britain, then they would have a numerical superiority over the Royal Navy. So from the beginning, Vergennes is interested in fostering this rebellion in America that he learns about when he gets the news of Lexington and Concord. But he knows that any aid that he provides has to be secret aid. This is 1775, and it's going to be 3 more years before the Navy is sufficiently reconstructed. And so Vergennes sends over an agent in 1775. He learns in about June or so, he learns of Lexington and Concord, and that agent sails from France. He's actually a French military officer named Bonvillars, and he poses as a businessman and lands in Philadelphia in early December of 1775, and he meets with a secret committee of Congress that included Benjamin Franklin. And their meetings were so secret, they had 3 separate meetings at night, and they met in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, which is still standing, while the Congress was meeting in the Pennsylvania State House, or what we call Independence Hall today. And the meetings were so secret that most of the members of Congress didn't know that they were going on. But at any rate, out of the meetings, Bonvillars goes back to France, and he sends a report to Vergennes, and in essence, he tells Vergennes, look, they are committed to fighting. Congress is going to fight, tells them that they'll fight to the last man. They have scads of soldiers to serve in the militia, so manpower shouldn't be an issue. They've got a continental army. It's very well led, he said, but The one thing they don't have are the resources, the resources to continue fighting. They don't have munitions, they don't have weaponry, they don't have uniforms, they don't have tents, all the things that an army needs. And so Vergennes goes to his monarch, Louis XVI, a very young guy. He had his father, Louis XV, had died of smallpox only, I don't know, maybe 18 months or so before this. And so Louis XVI is only about 22 years old. And he goes to him and he said, wants to provide secret aid. And there's a lot of resistance from the finance minister, Turgot. As you mentioned, the French economy is already wobbly. And Turgot says the first shot with if we go to war with Great Britain, if secret aid leads to war with Britain, the first shot will mean bankruptcy for France. So Louis XVI had a difficult decision to make, but he went with Vergennes and approved secret aid. And I think out of this, there are two things that really struck me. One is the importance of Vergennes through the entire Revolutionary War. Time and again, he continues to support the colonies. He's fixated on stripping Great Britain of those North American colonies. And I think Vergennes ought to be recognized more. I wrote an article in the Journal of the American Revolution online issue. It came out in April, and it was entitled America's Forgotten Founder. And I don't expect Americans to think more of Vergennes than they do of Washington or Franklin or Jefferson or whatever. But I think he should be better remembered. And as far as I've been able to determine, there's only one town in the United States that's named for Vergennes, and that's a town in Vermont. There may be more, but that's the only one that I've been able to find. And Louis XVI, of course, is a very sad figure in the long run because during the French Revolution, he winds up going to the guillotine in 1793. And I'm with Thomas Paine on this. Thomas Paine was actually wound up serving in the French Parliament. And in the debate over whether or not to execute Louis XVI, Paine tried to remind the French, look, he saved America. You've been a friend to America. We're a friend to you now. And rather than execute Louis XVI, why don't you send Louis XVI in exile to America? And this was a French republic. And Paine said, Louis XVI living in America can understand a republic and how good it is to have a republic and it'll be helpful to you. But he was outvoted and Louis went to the guillotine in January of 1793.
Wow. Well, and we're talking with Professor John Ferling, who's the author of Shots Heard Around the World. I'm going to start to bring in people with comments and questions. Just raise your hand on the old Zoom functions there. My last comment is, and of course I'll do more if there's necessary, is the issue of the military aspects of this. Because in your book, you talk about, and this is, everybody has argued these kind of questions for several hundred years now. Gage wants more troops before Lexington Concord doesn't get them. The question of Bunker Hill, and you look at the literature about the revolution in the past 30 years, they always emphasize how Bunker Hill was sort of such a bloody mess for the British that they didn't want to repeat that again. But then in the case of Bunker Hill, you had the newly arrived generals, Burgoyne, Clinton, and Howe. Clinton wants to sit there and land at the neck and envelop those troops. And then you have the incidents of the campaign in New York, which time and time again, there were these examples where if they had acted decisively, they would have crushed the revolution. Or at least that's the argument made by some historians. What do you make of all that?
I agree with that. With that, my previous book, Winning Independence, was a book in which, at least in part, I tried to rehabilitate the reputation of Sir Henry Clinton.
Yes.
He becomes the commander of the British Army in May of 1778, and he's in command of the army till after Yorktown. And he, even when he gets the note from Lord Germain, the letter from Lord Germain telling him he's been named the commander, uh, Clinton in effect says, "Oh my God, we're going to lose the war because I have to send about half of my troops to the West Indies. They couldn't defeat the Americans before the French came in. Now with half an army, I have to defeat both the Americans and the French." And so Clinton saw that he was really up against it at that point. And sure enough, when they lose the war, because he is the commanding general, his reputation suffered. But I think he was the time and again. I mean, he offered really sensible advice
Right.
to Hal, and on occasion Hal listened to it, but for the most part he didn't. I mean, you mentioned the Bunker Hill incident of Hal Gage rather had listened to Clinton. That bloody day would have been avoided, I think, by the British. And Clinton tried to persuade Howe in 1777, don't divide your army. Burgoyne's coming in from New York. You need to go up the Hudson River and rendezvous with Burgoyne's army. And Howe didn't listen. He went to
Right.
Philadelphia instead. Just a terrible decision on his part. And I think if Clinton had been appointed the commander of the British Army in early 76 instead of Howe, I think the war might have turned out differently. I mean, because we don't know how anybody's going to react once they get into power. I mean, no one could foresee Harry Truman being the kind of president that he became, for example,
Mm.
after FDR died. So we don't know, and nobody
Right.
expected Lincoln to be much
Right.
of a leader. So we don't know what would
Right.
have happened. So
Right.
I'm guessing there. But the bottom line is, I think the British had the capability of crushing the rebellion, and they made a number of mistakes. The first big mistake was that they engaged, told them that they were going to make a mistake if they didn't do this. They needed to send a much larger force to America before they used
Right.
force. They only had about 5,000 troops here on the day that the troops marched out to Concord. And Gage thought we need at least around 20,000 troops, because if the first battle had ended in the American force just being absolutely destroyed, there was a good chance that people living in Pennsylvania or North Carolina or whatever would have said, well, this proves that we can't stand up against British regulars, and things may have just uh, gone at that point. That might have just terminated the rebellion. And then they made I think in New York, especially, they had an opportunity to crush the rebellion. And I regard General Howe as just a very poor general who made a number of poor decisions in that New York campaign, decisions that I've wrestled with trying to understand why he made them, and I have to
Yeah.
say I don't
Sure.
I don't really know why. I mean,
Right.
they seem
Right.
incomprehensible.
Right. Perhaps for another time, because those are really interesting issues to go into. And of course, when you bring up Virgins, I'm going to go right to Alex. The question of the equipping of the Continental Army in 1777 is essential with the French weapons they get. And anyway, go on, Alex.
Yeah. Not only that, because I just went picked out of my bookcase again. Jonathan Ardall's great book on French Navy in the and American independence. And it's not just. I mean, the French are preparing for war, particularly their navy. Again, they're investing again, despite what Necker's objections. Their finance minister, starting like in 1774, really, and they're really gearing up and spending the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars. But the question I want to ask again is you didn't mention too much Lord George Germain, who often gets, he specifically gets a lot of the blame for the Saratoga campaign, because that was essentially his plan. And he's the one who insisted on, let's kind of divide send Howe to, Philadelphia, while, we have, and then Clinton somehow is supposed to link up. And of course, he comes too late to save Burgoyne at Saratoga. So I just wonder, and of course, again, there's the whole long history of Germain. What happened with him at Minden, where he's a cashier at that time for disobeying orders from Duke Frederick of the Prussian army, and then he has his reputation from there. So I just wonder what you think about Germain in all of this. Thanks.
Yeah, I covered Germain a little bit. Went into more detail about Germain in my previous book, Winning Independence. But I think Germain, I kind of have mixed feelings about him. I think he bears a great deal of responsibility for the flawed military strategy in 1777. Howe sends 4 different plans to the British for the campaign of 1777, and he starts with a plan where the British armies would remain unified, and his army in New York would go north up the Hudson and join with Burgoyne after Burgoyne took Albany. Then he begins to modify the plan for one reason or another. And I think Germain, I mean, he is the American secretary. He's ultimately really responsible, but he just simply, in the end, sides with Howe and lets Howe make the whatever plan he wants. And I understand that Germain has a tremendous disadvantage. He's 3,000 miles away. The means of communication are much slower in those days. Sometimes 40 or 50 days would elapse between the time Howe sent a plan to Germain and the time Germain received it. Germain didn't know what had gone on in the 40 or 50 days, intervening 40 or 50 days. So, but I think he could have used his power to just simply give orders to Howe not to divide the British Army. That said, on the other hand, after Saratoga, there certainly were elements in the British cabinet that either wanted to drop out of the war and simply grant independence to the colonists, or to shift the military action from North America to some other place, and with the French coming in, maybe shifted down to the Caribbean, for example. But Germain, I think, feels that the war still can be won in North America, and he presses for a southern strategy to shift down to try to take Georgia and the 2 Carolinas, possibly even Virginia as well. And at the very least, if that succeeds, the British will come out of the war not with all 13 colonies, but they'll have the colonies that were, from an economic standpoint, the most important for them because of the tobacco rice and indigo and whatever that they were getting from the southern colonies. So he does remain an advocate of continuing to press for the war. Ultimately, I think he makes a decision at the end of the war that turns out to be an absolutely terrible decision. Clinton had sent an army of about 5,000 men into Virginia. Starts with a very small army under Benedict Arnold in December of 1780, and then he expands the army in 1781. And what Clinton wanted to do was withdraw most of that army, just leave a token force in Virginia where it would be safe, and bring the bulk of that army back to New York to resist a joint Franco-American invasion of New York. And Germain intervenes and he orders Clinton to leave the army in Virginia. And Clinton's a soldier. He obeys his orders and he leaves the army under Cornwallis in Virginia. And that's the army that winds up at Yorktown, which the Allies take in October and brings on the end of the war. So I think Germain certainly bears responsibility for that decision, fatal decision.
Yeah, I was wanted to ask you about. I mean, among the important Revolutionary War campaigns, the one I think that gets neglected and is really only has a few books on is the Rhode Island campaign, because I just see that as being like missed opportunities for both sides. Like there were several points where like there could have been basically a big naval victory for the French or the British, or again that the British or the Americans could have gotten forced to surrounded at near Newport. And I also think kind of the lessons learned there by the French and the Americans for how to coordinate, because that was Sullivan that goes so badly and D'Estaing, that they kind of fixed a lot of those problems. And again, that pays off, with the Yorktown campaign, where the French and Americans are finally able to really cooperate both on, land and sea to, defeat Cornwallis. So I wonder your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Clinton saw the opportunity in Rhode Island, and he gathered a force together very quickly in New York and sent it to Rhode Island. And if the force had landed in time, it would have trapped the American army there. And Clinton, in fact, thought, and he says this in his correspondence, that this would be as great a defeat, the Americans would suffer as great a defeat in Rhode Island as the British had suffered at Saratoga only 1 year before. But the problem was, these things happen sometimes in war, and Clinton's armada that was sailing from New York to Rhode Island went much more slowly than they thought it would because of weather conditions. And by the time they got there, the Americans had been alerted and they were able to evacuate Rhode Island and escape what probably would have been a fatal blow to them. But that's the nature of war. All kind of things happen. And Washington took advantage of the bad weather at Trenton, and the Hessian troops in Trenton in December of 76 thought, they're not going to attack tonight. Nobody would go out in this kind of weather, and Washington did, and he won the battle. So, Clinton was foiled in that respect by the weather.
Mike, you're up. So you ask your question.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks a lot. Talk was great. And it's interesting to see that how far back American isolationism goes back. especially right to the very beginning. And also that when the French went for revenge, they seem to have forgotten, or if they knew it at all at that time, the Sicilian, old Sicilian saying, when you go for revenge, you dig two graves. But my questions are that the first question, it's two of them actually. The first question has to do with the issue of First Nations peoples or Native Americans in this particular case, and what the attitudes, how the issues involving Native Americans played into both the American perspective, or the colonist perspective, and the British perspective, as well as any others. And the second question is a little bit probably harder to pin down. But I just thought I'd throw it out there. Did the average, because you talked about to some degree about what average or regular colonists thought, do you think that the average or most colonists saw themselves as British? And did people in Britain see the colonists as British? They were British subjects, but did the colonists see themselves, and people in Great Britain see the colonists as fundamentally British?
Yeah, well, let me try to take both questions. The first one, real briefly. I think at the beginning of the war, both the British, the imperial leaders, and Washington and the leaders in the colonies tried to keep the indigenous peoples out of the war, and that was just beyond their control. There's soon all kind of fighting out on the frontier. The frontiers, some frontiersmen were loyalists, others weren't, and there's so much fighting that then it just becomes a major issue, and fighting continues on the frontier throughout the war, and Washington winds up sending Sullivan's expedition to try to destroy the Iroquois. So there's a great deal of fighting out there. As far as the British attitude, the American attitudes, the Americans did see themselves as Britishers who lived in America but wanted greater autonomy. I'm not sure about the British. I think it probably depends on the individual. But the one thing I could say is that by the time you get to the American Revolution, not because of the colonial troubles, but just throughout the 18th century, there are a number of people from Britain who come over to America for a whole variety of reasons. I mean, colonial officials who might live here for 4 or 5 years and then go home, businessmen who come over for brief periods and then they go back home, scientists who come over and then they go back home. And one of the things I think that sort of stands out is that many of these people do talk about the differences that they experience. They may have come over expecting the Americans to find exactly in America what they found in England. And instead, they found that the Americans spoke with different accents. They used the same words that were used in England, but they attributed different meanings to them. For example, the English use the word wheat to designate corn. The Americans use the word corn for what Americans still think of as corn. And they just found a lot of little differences, nothing real big, nothing that indicated that there was trouble on the horizon, but they did see differences in America. And also, I think there is some literature that goes back probably even before 1750, that where a great many people in England thought that the time would come when the Americans would break away. It's a big continent. The Americans only total about 20% of the population of Great Britain in 1775, but the population was growing very rapidly. And Benjamin Franklin even wrote a pamphlet. This is before the Revolution. Franklin wrote a pamphlet in which he said that by 1750, he thought the capital of the British Empire would be in Philadelphia and not in London. So he didn't say they would break away and become independent, but he recognized that America was probably going to become more powerful than Great Britain. And already they were talking about, both sides were talking about, Jim mentioned earlier when he talked about, I had worked on the Loyalist in my earliest works, that already people in America in the 1760s and 1770s were talking about the Americans and the British jointly moving into South America to gain territory or expanding to the West Coast. And so obviously changes were coming down the road, or they thought.
Just one follow-up. Thank you very much. The one follow-up to the indigenous issue, because I think that had to do with also expansionism, the different attitudes of the colonists versus the Crown or the British Parliament as far as expansionist ideas that would then affect indigenous people. So if you could go into that just a little bit more. Good, thank you.
Yeah, sure. With Joseph Brant, who was one of the leaders on the Five Nations Confederacy and the Iroquois, he goes to Britain with a team of people right in the early moments of the war, and he meets with the king and he meets with Lord Germain, and Germain promises Brant, if you stay with us, if you help us, and this would be a means of distracting the American army and dividing their military capabilities and whatever, we won't let you down. But obviously, in the final analysis, in the Treaty of Paris that ends the war, the British wind up relinquishing the territory that Brant and his people lived in and had fought for, and the British turned their back on them in the final peace settlement.
And the Americans also did not wanted the ability to expand if in future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in the peace negotiations, Franklin and John Adams and John Jay were our three principal diplomats, and they pushed for gaining all of the territory from the Appalachians out to the Mississippi River. The Treaty of Alliance with France specified that France would guarantee that they would fight till America became independent, and that the Americans would possess what they possessed when the war began and what territory they won during the war. Well, they didn't really win much west of the Appalachians. So Jay and Adams and Franklin had a tough road to hoe to get that territory, because the Spanish didn't want them in there. The French really wanted America to be a small state that would be a client state of theirs, and not a great military power in the long run. But they in the end, Vergennes stays out of the American negotiations with the British, and the Americans are able to get that territory west of the mountains, and that's just absolutely crucial, I think, in understanding American history. Without that, the Americans would have been encircled by the British. Britain would have had Canada, would have had the Transmontane West, and there would have been no land. And I think probably in that instance, what would have probably happened is in 20 years or so, those who were in power in the United States would have said, we just can't keep going this way. We're going to have to reunify with Great Britain. And so getting that territory west of the mountains to the Mississippi River is absolutely crucial in American history. So hats off to Adams and Jay and Franklin.
Yeah, I should note that down the road, we're going to have Colin Calloway from Dartmouth, Ned Blackhawk from Yale, and Michael Witkin from Columbia, who will be getting into deeper and more focused discussion on these issues. And John, of course, you're welcome to join us. Go on, Julian. You're unmuted. You need to unmute. We can't hear you, Julian.
I'm sorry. Were you asking me?
No, no, Julian is.
Oh, okay.
He's.
I apologize. Yeah, I didn't plug in my microphone. Much more basic problem.
Well, I always blame it on Trump, those issues, man. Go on.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ferling. I'm actually a professor at Concordia University in Montreal in political science. I teach strategic studies. A fascinating presentation. I have a comment and two questions. The first is, in fact, Johns Hopkins had their strategic studies annual meeting at Vergennes. So we actually knew who he was every year. There's an elite golf course with its own airfield at Vergennes, which is obviously a beautiful place to be discussing strategic studies. I have a question on Gage. I'm actually a descendant of General Gage. He was a governor here in Montreal for many years. And I think the academic and family interpretation is that the difficulties he faced were actually not English, it was Dutch. I mean, his wife was Dutch. And if you go down that rabbit hole, New York still had a very large self-organized Dutch population, and which were self-consciously anti-English and wanting to return, even if it was 150 years earlier, to this self-governance. So it was not, I mean, there was not only the, hey, English, we're English, but we want to, move past a monarchy. There was also an ethnic component of, let's get the English out of here. Let's bring New York back to what it was before, which is essentially a self-governing Dutch colony. I'm not sure how influential the Dutch community was by that time, but certainly Gage's Dutch wife was, was told by his father-in-law that do bad to the English. So I'm wondering if you'd comment on the non-English ethnic push for revolution. Another issue is something I've talked to Jim about several times, which I don't know much about the American Revolution, but I do know a fair bit about the British Civil War. And we have this assumption that the way the Americans behave, which is demanding the obvious, which is we want representation if we're being taxed, is actually not that normal historically. When you've got, for example, Mahan or even Napoleon characterizing the British, they describe this phenomenally well-organized oligarchy. But most rich agricultural landowners who dabble a bit in commerce actually get along great with the executive through bribes. But in England, you had, frankly, a super low threshold trigger for the Civil War, which is a 1% tax on inland counties to pay for the Navy, and aggregating the hymn book with the Scots. And people just set off. And the king facilitated it by having an election, canceling it, and then holding another election 15 years later, where about 20% of the same people got reelected. So he solved the collective action problem of Americans think this is normal, but these are hot, sort of easily triggered quasi-capitalist merchants and agricultural landowners. So I was wondering, can you comment on this what I think is a peculiar American sociology of thinking that people could govern themselves just because they have a smidgen of local business experience? Thank you.
Well, yeah, let me take the first issue, first question first, and that is, I think just there's a variety of attitudes all through the colonies, and you in a general sense you could say there was probably more hostility in New England than there was in any other section of the country. We usually divide the colonies into New England, middle colonies, southern colonies, and probably more hostility toward the British in New England at the outset of the war. But even having said that, I think if you look at individual colonies, whether it's South Carolina or New Jersey or whatever, there you find sections in the colonies where there's much more hostility to Britain than in other parts of the colony. And the second question, I think what I was thinking of when you asked that was one of the things that I discovered as I was writing this book, and was a bit surprised, was the degree of the breakdown of domestic support for the war in Britain. I'm not saying that everybody felt that way, but it was a long, tough war. A lot of people were adversely impacted by the war, whether it was paying taxes or losses of trade. In certain areas, particularly in the areas where textiles were a major industry, there was a great deal of depression. A lot of those guys who were laborers in the textile industry went into the British Army. As a matter of fact, as 3 or 4 years into the war, and I was surprised to encounter that as I went through. Most people, I think, loyally supported the war, but there were those Gordon riots that occurred in England about 5 or 6 years into the war. And after that, I think Lord Germain's correspondence with Clinton primarily begins to change. And the thrust of what Germain is saying is this war just can't go on much longer. We've got to bring an end to the war, and I think that led Germain, in fact, to want to keep that army in Virginia, hoping that it could knock Virginia out of the war, and he thought that would be the thing that would eventually force the colonists to accept some sort of negotiated settlement.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferling.
Sure.
All right, Mark, go on, Mark.
Thank you very much for the John, for the presentation. I had kind of a double question, just the first one to set up the second one. My understanding from historians is that they estimate support for the War of Independence to be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, being 1/3 pro, 1/3 against, and 1/3 just leave us alone. First of all, is that standing up still to this day with historians? And then in terms of the third that presumably supported independence, what were the motivations and how did the motivations change, class by class, so to speak, or even state by state?
Yeah, I think the first issue is John Adams was the one who, at some point after the war, reflecting on it, said 1/3 of the population supported the revolution, 1/3 remained loyal to Britain.
Oh, okay.
And the other third didn't care.
Yeah.
And but now I think the general feeling among historians is that they usually use a qualifier and say that 20% of those who were active in the revolution remain loyal, but that 80% who were active in the revolution supported the revolution. I don't think we'll ever know exactly. They didn't make census.
No, it's too late now.
That
No.
sort of thing. But that was that was the main thing. And I've forgotten what your second question.
The second question, in terms of the people that did support independence, what were their motivations and how did that differ from societal class to class and from state to state, basically?
Yeah, I think there were just, so many different reasons for supporting the revolution. Uh, there were merchants who wanted free trade, wanted to escape the restrictions of the British Navigation Acts and mercantile policies. Certainly, there were people who were speculating in land, like George Washington,
It
for
was, yeah, a lot of
instance.
them were, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and they were hoping to have more freedom of being able to open the West. And there were, population was growing very rapidly. It was a farming society, and people had large families, and only one son in the family could inherit dad's farm. So the other sons had to go elsewhere if they were going to remain farmers. And most of the people remained farmers in America until you get up to about the 1840s or so, long after the Revolution. And the only way they were going to get land was if the country if there was expansion west of the mountains. And I think that was a matter of interest. Religion is a factor. There's some people that wanted to break, Baptists down in the South wanted to break away from the Anglican Church and having to pay state taxes to support the Anglican Church. There was bitterness that the British kept an army in America. There was a great deal of fear of standing armies at the time. That something that we're now beginning to hear a little bit about after National Guard and the Army's been sent to Los Angeles and D.C. And so I mean, there's just a multiplicity of reasons. Certainly, as I mentioned it early in the broadcast, the people who, like Franklin and Washington and Adams and everybody you can think of who plays a major role, was ambitious. And there are people who are just patriots. I mean, they saw themselves as Americans, and they wanted to support the American cause. And there are other people who are in it because they probably don't have much choice. They're in the militia, and the militia is activated by their governor, and they have to serve. And by 1780 and 81, Governor Jefferson in Virginia is beginning to experience some cases of mutiny in his militia. And there's mutiny in the Continental Army in January of 1780. Mutiny in the New Jersey line and in the Pennsylvania line. So a lot of those guys maybe initially were really enthused about serving, but it's a long, long war, and their enthusiasm waned as the war went along.
Okay. Thank you, John.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll end with Aaron. Go on, Aaron.
Great. Thank you, Jim, for organizing this, and thank you, sir, for this great talk. I'm wondering. So I live in New Jersey. I'm a member of the. I'm sure you know about the Crossroads of the American Revolution in Trenton, where we document and study everything about the Revolutionary War from a New Jersey perspective. And New Jersey had over 600 battle skirmishes, engagements, and encompassing almost 3,000 square miles and presently over 250 municipalities. I'm wondering, I have a sort of a New Jersey determinist view of this, where I kind of see New Jersey as the Vietnam for the British Army, in that they got pulled into this slog in New Jersey, whether it was the 4-H War, whether it was the 10 decisive days. The casualties they and the Hessians took were quite substantial. More losses in the 4-H War in New Jersey than the British suffered completely in New York throughout the whole war. And I'm just wondering, do you have a perspective on a sort of New Jersey, how it fits as a swivel in the conflict between where it starts, in New England and sort of where it finishes in the Southern colonies.
Before you answer that, John, just remember, Aaron, those of us in Manhattan have a different view about New Jersey.
Okay, but I have data, so I mean, sorry.
Go on, man.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know far more about the New Jersey situation than I do, but really about all I can say about it is that the British High Command regarded New Jersey as of extreme importance, and once they come into New York, they spend very little time, waste very little time before they're getting troops into to New Jersey to try to take control of New Jersey. I mean, we'd give them control on both sides of the Hudson, to the lower Hudson River, and I think that was key. And every colony that can be pacified and subdued would help them elsewhere. But that's about as much as I could comment on New Jersey. I haven't studied it in detail.
Well, I
Great,
think
thank you.
one thing important about what Aaron's mentioning, I remember the late David Surratt, who was a historian of the Revolution.
Sure.
And we used to argue about how New Jersey was sort of as Aaron has brought up, this huge place of contention between the British, the Loyalists, the Patriots. Westchester was, Queens was a no man's land. They referred to it as a no man's land because of the nature of foraging expeditions that were kept on going on from the areas that the English controlled to the time of evacuation. So there's a lot about that people, Tarleton, of course, has his claim to fame when he's up there in Westchester, first initiating the kind of brutal kind of restisages he starts to do, which becomes famous for further in the South. But in any event, listen, John, it was absolutely fantastic. We really enjoyed having you come and talk. As I said, we'd love to have you come and talk another time, a few other times, because it's very good and really rewarding to hear you talk about this. The book we were talking about today with John is Shots Heard Round the World. So go out and go buy it. And it's a very good introduction to the wider picture of the international environment that the revolution occurs in. And what I find very good about it is it's Clausewitzian, because you see the interrelationship of politics and military operations vividly in the book.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about us. Have a good day.
Okay, you too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for organizing, Jim.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Hey,
Great
guys,
job.
take it easy, guys.
Cheers.